Jan has talked in his introduction about making things systemic. Policymakers have got a huge opportunity and role to play in helping to make that change systemic. Actions have been taken on both sides of the Atlantic. In a few minutes, we'll have the opportunity to listen to Lucas Wiesek from the cabinet of Executive Vice President Timmermans. Lucas, you're very welcome. But first of all, I'm going to hand the floor over to Undersecretary for Farm Production and Conservation in the United States Department of Agriculture. Robert Bonney, you're very welcome indeed. The floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Mark. You started your remarks this morning by saying half of life is just showing up. I apologize for not showing up there with you today and hope maybe I get partial credit for being online with you today. I want to start by just acknowledging the importance of the Transatlantic Partnership, the partnership we all have, particularly as we face these dual challenges of global food security and climate change. And I think that partnership is going to be more important than ever. I want to talk to you today about the U.S. approach, particularly as it relates to climate-smart agriculture and what we're doing domestically. As you all know, globally, obviously, agriculture and forestry account for significant global emissions. In the U.S., U.S. agriculture accounts for about 11% of U.S. greenhouse gas emissions. And that's grown over time, in part because we've reduced emissions in other parts of the economy, and so as a proportion of the economy, agriculture has grown. That's the bad news. The good news is there are lots of opportunities, as you all well know, to reduce emissions, to increase sequestration in soils and ecosystems and grasslands, even while we reduce emissions in nitrous oxide and methane and carbon. One of the things that I point out to lots of folks in the U.S. is in the U.S. we're often sort of conditioned to see environmental issues as trade-offs. As I began my career working in biodiversity conservation, and oftentimes you see a trade-off between conservation activities on our working lands, our farms, our ranches, and our forests, and those biodiversity goals. And interestingly, in climate change, the opposite is true a lot. That is, we see alignment between good agronomic practices, soil health practices, no-till, cover crops, improved nutrient management that can reduce nitrous oxide emissions, and a host of other practices that both can be really good from an agronomic standpoint, from a productivity standpoint, even as they're good from a climate standpoint. And so as we think about policy in the U.S., we think about how do we take advantage of that alignment. That's not to say that there aren't costs associated with climate-smart agriculture, getting producers to adopt new practices, to change the things they're doing. It's not that there aren't costs, but there is, generally speaking, alignment there, which I think is important. There's also skepticism in rural America about what environmental policy looks like and what climate change policy looks like in particular. Skepticism about concerns about a top-down regulatory-heavy approach and the need for an approach that invites agriculture in to address climate change. There's also some skepticism, and we all know this, about the role that agriculture can play internationally in reducing greenhouse gas and making greenhouse gas emissions and making real reductions, again, both through sequestration and emissions reductions. And we've seen that in the international conversation for a long, long time. And so the accountability is really important. How do we hold ourselves accountable for those emissions reductions? In the U.S., as we think about policy, we recognize that there are limits to a regulatory approach. Regulation in the United States has been really good at stopping bad things from happening. It's not as good as encouraging landowners, folks in agriculture, to adopt conservation practices. And that's fundamentally what we're trying to do. We're trying to get our farmers, our ranchers, our forest landowners to adopt conservation practices that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions, increase sustainability, even while we maintain productivity. So what you'll see from the Biden administration, from the U.S. when it comes to climate-smart agriculture, you'll see a real concentration on incentive-based approaches, approaches that try to capture emerging markets, whether it be for carbon or climate smart commodities or greening of supply chains. Our approach will be one about partnerships and collaboration. USDA has significant resources, but we can't do it alone. We have to work across agriculture with our universities and lots of other partners to get things done. Ultimately, we want to work with agriculture and not work against or adopt practices to agriculture. We want this to be about a partnership. Innovation and technology are absolutely critical. We also have to recognize in what we do that we've got to maintain productivity. If we're gonna address the dual challenge of food security and climate change, we have to address productivity. Productivity is also important as a climate strategy. As we think about the pressures that result in tropical deforestation or conversion of grasslands, maintaining productivity, the ability to produce the same amount or more on our existing land base is critically important. And even while we think in the U.S. about a voluntary approach that will be farmer-led, accountability is really important. We have to be able to measure our results over time and ensure that we can actually meet emissions targets. In U.S. policy, let me talk a little bit about some of the specifics we're doing. We've recently announced $2.8 billion of investments in something we're calling Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities. These are projects that are designed to deploy climate smart practices at scale, to measure and monitor those, the impacts of those over time, and then to take advantage of emerging markets, again, for whether it be carbon or climate smart commodities or greening supply chains, so that the market, the private sector, can actually step up and partner with USDA to help support the deployment of climate smart practices. When we originally announced this, we set aside $1 billion. We got $20 billion in proposals from all of agriculture, all crops, all parts of the country, lots of universities, conservation groups, commodity groups participating. We've also made, are going to make significant investments in climate smart agriculture through the Inflation Reduction Act. These are programs that allow us to partner with agriculture to cost share, that is to share the costs of adopting practices across livestock, cropland, and forest land. And so over the next decade, we will make substantial investments in those types of partnerships with our producers on the ground. We're also making investments in science, in research, but also in inventory, improving our inventory again so we can hold ourselves accountable, and working with folks internationally and things like AIM4C so that we can not only invest in innovation and technology, but that we can share information, learn from each other. Let me conclude with two final thoughts. First, I think it's important as we think about climate smart agriculture that we focus on outcomes versus certain prescriptions. U.S. agriculture is so diverse across different climates, different production types. Similarly on forestry, we've got to allow for flexible approaches, adaptation, and therefore a focus on outcomes rather than specific practices is important. And I'll end with a thought on where I began, which is just the importance of the U.S.-EU partnership through the collaboration platform of agriculture, and to acknowledge that there's lots that we can learn from you all. I would say we learned a little bit from the Dutch this weekend on football, but we can learn a lot on agriculture from the Dutch and a lot of other folks. And I think that partnership, exchange of information between our agricultural sector and your all's, between our policymakers is critically important. So thanks for the time today, Mark. I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Undersecretary. I know you're on the clock. Two quick questions as follow-up. You talked about skepticism in rural America, and you know, on both sides of the Atlantic, it comes back to farmers, ranch owners, landowners being able to deliver some of the outcomes that we're looking for. How far do you think the measures that you've put in place, the money that you've put in place, the incentives you're trying to draw out of the private market are going to go to overcoming that skepticism? And then just finally, really where you ended, how big is the opportunity for EU-US collaboration in this area?
So on the skepticism side, I think a lot of our folks, our rural constituencies, have a mindset about how environmental policy has worked in the past. And it's felt to them regulatory heavy, top down. And for climate to work, again, because our job is to get folks to adopt these practices. We've got to figure out how we partner with our farmers and ranchers and forest owners. Now, the good news is there is a long history of stewardship in the United States, whether it's on wildlife, water quality. There's always more to do, but there's a strong stewardship ethic amongst our producers. And if we can tap into that, it's really important. At the end of the day, even with that ethic, this stuff has to pencil. It has to actually work for agriculture. We have to maintain productivity. We have to maintain rural livelihoods. And so an approach which is about partnerships, which is about incentives, which is about building market opportunities that can ultimately compensate folks for the investments they make, I think is critically important. And again, you will see that reflected in what it is we do. Obviously, I talked about all the information, practices, science that we can share. I think that is critically important. Again, there are lots of things we can learn from you all, lots of innovations there that we can think about here. And I think likewise, there may be innovations that we have in the US that are going to be important there. And I think, as we think about internationally trading rules or those types of institutions, I think it's really, really important that we recognize the importance of innovation, of technology, of flexibility, of allowing, the types of flexible approaches that we see that can allow producers to do things that not only benefit them, but that can benefit the climate at the same time.
Great. Well, Mr. Undersecretary, thank you very much indeed. I did say that half of life is about showing up. I didn't say whether that was in person or virtually. I know your agenda is stretched. We really do appreciate you joining us today. Let's give the Undersecretary a round of applause. Thank you.
Thanks.